Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Gaby Yepes. I'm a member. I'm going to read because I cannot improvise in English. Sorry. I'm a member of the Andean Studies Student Organization here on the UW campus. We are extremely honored to have Dr. Frank Salomon back in Madison and with us today. Dr. Salomon is an ethnographer and ethnicist. You want to clap, please? Go ahead. Dr. Salomon is an ethnographer and an ethnohistorian of the Andes and an expert in anthropology of religion and Native American systems of writing. He is the John Murrah Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at our university, past president of the American Society of Ethnohistory, and has held the Guggenheim, the School for Advanced Research, and the National Science Foundation fellowships. He has authored many books and articles, including, and this is my personal selection, that's it. The Huarochiri manuscript, A Testament of Ancient and Colonial Andean Religion, The Court Keepers, and At the Mountain's Altar, Anthropology of Religion in an Andean Community. Today, he's giving a talk about facial bone masks in Peruvian mythohistory and the reappearance in museums. I was extremely lucky to see this talk in Cusco, in Peru over the summer, and I'm more than happy now that he accepted our invitation to come and give it here in Madison. Please join me again to welcome him. Madison. Thank you.
Thank you. From the heart, Alberto Vargas and Sarah Ripp. And thanks especially to Gabriela Yepes, who just spoke and who, with a completely self-propelled collection of sympathetic students, is giving Andean studies a new voice on our campus. I can't even tell you how good it feels to be back here under the color-turning trees and the chilly air, and this place that I worked and loved and had such wonderful opportunities for 3 decades of my lucky life. First of all, I want to say, it may be that some of us have scruples about viewing Native American remains. I would like to say that in this case, that scruple is out of place because these remains were not prepared to be hidden in the earth. These remains were made to be seen, to be honored and learned. And that's what we will do today. In 1891, this Italian antiquarian saw them freshly extracted from the earth of Huarochiri, from a cave in Huarochiri. And he did not know what they are, although he published these beautiful drawings and a report on facial bone masks from ancient Peru. He could only take a wild guess what they were for because the Huarochiri manuscript, the greatest single source on the Quechua-speaking peoples of the Andes, had not yet been published or translated. He knew them only as objects. And I knew them only as words. We know a lot about the place where they belong. This map shows the space of Huarochiri province in western Peru. It includes what later became the city of Lima. And it is inhabited by humans who saw themselves as 2 kinds of people. In the orange spaces, there were prominent highland communities of farmers and herders who called themselves Yauyos. And a subcategory that we'll face up to was the Checa. They saw themselves as people of the extreme heights of the cold pastures just at the top of the biosphere. They saw themselves as migrants who, like so many herding people around the world, have advanced and pressed onto valleys where the biota are richer, where agriculture and irrigation are possible. Those are the green spots on the map, valleys cutting down to the Pacific Ocean, and the people who live there, makers of the archaeological splendor that you would see in any good museum, were in their mouths called yuncas. What we're going to see today has everything to do with the apparently conflictive but also constructive intermeshing of people moving out of the freezing highlands and coming into the valleys. Checa entering the world of the Yunca. And I knew these same objects only as words. When I studied the Huarochirí manuscript for counting my graduate student cathexis with this text from 1971 to its publication in 1992, while I was in Wisconsin. It's unique among written sources insofar as it's a text from and not just about a Quechua-speaking community, which had already lived at the time for 1 year under the Spanish Empire, that had acquired Catholicism, but still retained encyclopedic knowledge in depth of a single pre-Columbian tradition. For example, these words in trilingual. If a man was captured in combat, he himself would say, "Now you're about to kill me, but I was a man of great powers. Now you're going to make me into a Wayo." We didn't know what a Wayo was. So as for me, when I'm about to go onto the Pampa, the field of ritual, serve me good food and have me drink well. A speech of warrior grandeur, which interestingly, fascinatingly, has near parallels throughout the Americas. If you are a Latin Americanist, you might be thinking of Jean de Lery, published in 1580, the speech of a Tupinamba warrior on the far extreme, the other side of the American continent, who similarly was killed honorifically and has had his words at his glory in his own saying at the end of his life before he was eaten. In Brazil, they ate him. In Peru, what? The reason that the warrior spoke about going to the Pampa of ritual is because after he had been refashioned into a Wayo, he would be carried in a litter along with other immortalized dead, together with offerings to Omapacha, mysterious word, but in the local ethnic language, which is not Quechua, Omapacha seems to mean waterland. Waterland means the places on the heights where atmospheric rain meets soil, the places that make Yunca life possible, the places that make pasture possible. For example, the high lakes and the water meadows. And so, when they went up to these ancient places, they brought a Wayo. What's a Wayo? To meet with other Wayo, another Wayo, their ancestor, Nyansapa. What is a Wayo? Who is a Wayo? John Verano, one of the great scholars in the field of physical anthropology and osteology, tried to sum up the very large corpus about American trophy head taking with the antithesis enemy or ancestor. Are we talking about people killed out of enmity, or are we talking about people preserved in reverence for ancestry? He saw that as a choice that we had to make. Soon we'll know the answer, but what we can already see is that a Wayo, this physical object, was a kind of hero. To create a Wayo among the Cheka meant to make something more than human out of a human, to make for the Cheka a being that would speak in the sources of life, land and water, for their future, for their hopes of becoming agro-pastoralists. This book brings together very many hundreds of examples of human body trophy taking among the Native American peoples. A large part of this discussion has taken place in South America, coast to coast, where some of the classic ethnographies from early colonial times onward have told us about people who treasured the heads of lives lost in battle or afterwards. And so, starting to reply to John Verano, ancestors or enemies, we can be skeptical about ancestors because among the peoples who have done this, many, even most of them, are human groups which are known for not practicing ancestor cults. Many of them are people who are known for solutions of the problem of the dead that include immediately disposing of the dead and not making ancestor shrines. So here we must be facing something else. What else? The most single publicly notorious example is the case of the shrunken head, or Tsansa, created by the Shuar peoples, who are a large group to the east of the Andes, there in the western edge of Amazonia, and who have small decentralized settlements or mini societies known for warring with each other, fierce raiding, which results in the capture of a head. The capture of the shrunken head became a fetish in Western museology as a kind of, it was perceived as a grotesque emblem of the savage state. My first contact with South American ethnography was one of these in the South American hall called Men of the Montaña in the Museum of Natural History in New York. You might think, everybody used to think, that a Tsansa was important because it was a symbol of cruel victory that would inflict upon the humiliated foe shame and grief. But that's not all there is to it. There is a magnificent French ethnographer called Anne-Christine Taylor, who, in her whole research life, learned and studied among Shuar people. The Shuar idea was that the creation of a trophy head is a recipient which will contain the warrior soul or mwisak of a fallen foe, which will be sealed in but which will not die. The trophy, a precious container of enduring life, would be domesticated. It would be received into the house. It would be spoken to with terms appropriate for an in-law. It would be married. A victorious man could marry one of these as a secondary spouse of his wife. And the wife might have a baby, and the baby would be appreciated as a child of this fallen foe. And in time, that baby would grow into a future ancestor of the warrior's own group. An heir for the victorious family. And that is not unique, far from unique. For example, the famous example of trophy scalp taking in many parts of North America, including the Great Plains and including also Iroquois in the northeast of New York and Ontario. Scalps were received as fertilizing gifts to spouses. They were spoken to with in-law terms. This example of a society noted for its imagery of trophy heads comes from a Yunka people on the western coast of Peru on the Pacific shore, a very long time, much earlier than the time we're talking about, in which we notice that trophy heads have plants growing from their tongues. In other words, owning the trophy head would be a source of super fertilization to the livelihood of irrigating agricultural people. The antithesis between ancestor and enemy dissolves before our eyes, even in modern ethnography. This amazing testimony was collected by a couple of an English woman who married an Aymara man in 2004. The old people of Jacachaca, which is in Oruro, Bolivia, remember that the objective of war was the capture of an enemy trophy head. This married man would then give the trophy head to his wife, who would then take charge of wrapping him in a fine spun textile, often decorated with designs of skulls, with the objective of transforming the incarnated spirit in the head, transforming it into a child of his own group. 2004. All this time, I knew about Ohio from words. I had a mental idea of what kind of an object it would be, but I'd never seen one until I found that drawing by those Italian ethnologists. Of course, they couldn't know that it was Ohio because they had no access to the Warochiri book. When I found out that I was looking at a drawing of Ohio, I talked to my friend, the young historian, Chris Haney, whose beautiful book about the fate of South American heads has recently been published by Oxford. And it's really a remarkable, and I'm sure it will be a prize-winning work. We talked in Philadelphia, a place with a notable collection of heads. And he said, I have visited all the relevant museums, and I think there might still be a Ohio. He looked into it. His research enthusiasm was to find out why museums in the US and some parts of Europe became avid for Peruvian skulls, and finding out how skull fever figured in the early history of American anthropology. He knew that as of 1990, the Smithsonian had at least 30,700 human bones and other body parts. The largest single corpus was Peruvian skulls, 4,851 individuals. Their export by Peruvians began very early, almost at the moment of independence, when Peruvian Creole scientists wanted to show to the other countries the individuals who they saw. They wanted these human remains to be recognized as a civilizing people, a great Inca people. But as we'll see, in Washington and many other places, notably Boston and Philadelphia, they were absorbed instead into North Atlantic ideologies of racial hierarchy. In 1835, Dr. Samuel Morton, a notable surgeon in Philadelphia, cut the head off a mummy from the Atacama of northern Chile and displayed her at the Philadelphia Museum with her glossy black hair still shining. Morton believed, as many believed in that time, that the shape and size of the cranium revealed the diversity and racial destiny of people within the polygynous paradigm, that is, the notion that humanity has multiple origins of multiple races in a very strong sense of the word. Influenced by those Peruvian Creole intellectuals, he saw the Incas, and of course he thought all of these heads were Inca. The multi-ethnicity of the Andes was not yet understood. He thought of those people as being the civilizers of America, or as he put it, America's Egypt. But he was working within a transatlantic discourse about polygyny, about the depth and transhistorical decisiveness of race. After he studied a great many more Peruvian skulls, he concluded that the Incas had been a civilizing race, while other inferior New World races, including the ones he knew in North America, had degenerated. He meant his account of the Incas as the New World's cultural leaders as words of praise. But in North America, people took this argument as justification for obliterating the North American cultures who had lost the transcendent Inca mystique. Ephraim George Squire in 1877 showed the world this Peruvian skull which has undergone trephining. Ancient surgeons had cut away part of its skull to remove a mental illness. Many more trephined skulls had been found, and many of them were the skulls of people who survived that surgery. And this became a scientific and sort of proto-archaeological fad of the first war. It was taken to mean that ancient Americans were scientific people who practiced surgical medicine. A fad ensued for the acquisition of trephined heads. Many thousand of them were dragged out of their places of repose, mummy caves, or ancestral conservation buildings. One of the people who supplied heads to the enormous booming market for South American skulls was a Peruvian called Julio Cesar Tello, whose father was in a small business, in the small way in the skull business. He himself extracted skulls where? In Huarochirí, in the very place that we're talking about. He grew up there. He grew up handling and looking at the ossified ancestors. And although we find this story hateful, a lot of credit, a very great credit, is due to Julio Cesar Tello, because he was the first Peruvian who seriously tried to apply the emerging science as opposed to antiquarianism, science of archaeology. And he laid down many of the foundations of what we now know about ancient South America. But still, the bone business carried him away. There was a foundational scientist at Harvard called Aleš Hrdlička from what was later called Czechoslovakia, who also was immensely fascinated with skulls. Julio Tello was known as a whiz kid, applied to Harvard, and Hrdlička brought him in, probably with a hidden agenda of acquiring the large family collection of skulls that Julio Cesar Tello's family had looted. And Tello, who was no dope, brought his skulls with him in chests to Boston. That was the golden age of skull fever. And in the next few decades, vast swarms of looters, of scientists, entered the caves and the buildings where the ancient people dwell and sold them to scientists and collectors around the world. A little in the later stages, just toward this apogee of skull fever, we come across this guy, George Kiefer, one of the skull hunting crowd, whose way of science was supplying South American heads to the Army Medical Museum, which still existed when I was a kid. I'll never forget seeing it. A strange combination of grotesquerie and scientific sincerity. Chris Haney found the cover letter for a shipment of those skulls to the Army Medical Museum. He said, the boxes contain 88 heads, 2 pieces of ceramic. All of the heads are narrow and long, which was considered a crucial racial trait, peculiar to the tribe of the Aymara, which were obtained in the heights of San Mateo in the valley of Primac in Huarochirí province, 12,000 feet over sea level. 12,000 feet. These 4,000 meter altitudes are at the very extreme of the livable world, and they are endowed with many caves, which became the dwellings of preserved, that is to say, mummified and dressed ancestors. The big outline is Huarochirí province, and the little oval is that place, San Mateo. San Mateo de Huanchos. That's what it looks like today, because the Rimac River has been channeled into one large canal. Another letter from the skull dealer. Quote, you will find many of these Highland skulls have their faces cut out, many of them. I had the luck of finding a mask, which explains everything. I attached a mandible to the part of the mask that I was found, so that you can form an idea of how they used to unite these parts using a substance similar to catgut to attach the mandible at the point of juncture at the joint. The holes in the upper part served to fix the mask onto the face. And that is the accession document by which the Army Medical Museum obtained this Ohio, the Ohio that Chris Haney ran down. And so the hunch that he expressed when we had that meeting long ago at Penn became real study. The physical study of the Ohio is still in an early stage. The person in charge of it is Dr. Chris Stantis, an osteological archaeologist and an expert on paleopathologies. So here's what Kiefer said we would see. Through the holes in the upper part have passed cords to fix the mask onto the face. Stantis and her students have studied the possibly sexual traits of this head, and she is of the opinion that it could be a female, but it's not a very decisive opinion at all, because she says only a few of the required measurements were obtained. This person, whether or not she was female, died at about the age of 35. Her tooth wear with dentin exposure suggests that she was somebody with a particularly tough diet. That means somebody whose staff of life diet was likely to include grit that grinds the enamel of teeth. An agricultural diet, not typical to the meat-rich diet of Chekas, of the Highlanders, who didn't eat corn. They did eat roughly ground crops, but not in large amounts. Of course, to Wisconsin people, the first thing that they will think is that the work on these tooth still needs to be done. Something has to be extracted from them and subjected to a science that grew to some splendor here in Madison, of stable isotope analysis. That is a study of chemical properties of the interior of teeth, which reveal what nutrients the person consumed. When that gets done, with all the now extremely difficult permissions that have to be gotten, they will reveal whether this person ate the varied diet of a Yunka or the relatively restricted diet of a Highlander. But Stantis and the two students who are mentioned in the bottom line have done some work on paleopathologies. Also, these are very early stages of the scientific report. Shows a possible abnormal alienation of the jaw, or some kind of a trauma affecting the jaw, but we don't know whether that could have been the death blow. The beveling of the top of the skull shows how finely this work was done on the sacrificed person. Drilling of the neatly beveled holes also shows that when the ancient Cheka, or whoever it was that made this particular Wayo, made a hero to the measure of their own needs, they made it very carefully as a treasure quality object. The same kind of treasure curating artisanship is found in trophy heads from other parts of the New World. These are still within the Andean orbit. But if you think a little bit about the placement of these cord securing perforations, you can see that they're not Wayos because the passing strings in those locations would not balance the skull so as to be stable over the face of a living person. These two students at Vanderbilt University are doing a job that was taught to them by Steve Warnke, another old friend from Wisconsin, did his doctorate, and who now conducts photogrammetric study of the Wayo among many other objects. If you find this URL, you will be able to see a movable photogrammetric rendering in which you can see this from all angles and facets, including the inside, and imagine what it would be like to wear a Wayo. Another transmission letter, this one from the man who was at that time directed the Army Medical Museum. And so up to this point, Chris and I felt that we had really found the Warochiri thing. We didn't know whether it belonged to the advancing Cheka or whether it belonged to the Yuncas. But we knew that the story we had read in this supposedly mythological ancient book was not a mythology, it was an ethnography. And then we kept looking. Giulia and Mattei, Italians, both returned to Italy later in life. And as Chris suspected, they sold their archaeological finds in Italian collections and museums, including the ones that we looked at the start of the lecture, the very ones that we see in that marvelous publication of 1891. They are identified geographically close enough for us to know that they come from the very extreme northern edges of the Warochiri orbit, not in the Rimach Valley, but in the next valley. They would have belonged to the people that those ancient Warochirianos called the Colli, and which they identified as Yuncas. They are in Museo della Civiltà in Roma. That museum at this point has us on the edge of our seats because just after Chris examined these two old friends of ours, we learned that the museum is closing to be refurbished. And so all the work that needs to be done here has been postponed. It's going to be steady work. These are the people that we know. Plus, there was a third bonus, or for us, a fourth Wayo in that Roman collection. That's the one on the extreme right. And that one does have a note of provenience. It comes from Supe. Quite a surprise. Supe is not near Warochiri. It's the same class of artifact, but from a somewhat remote location. And so it's time for us to think about the geography of the Wayos. This is a broad photo, a broad map of the terrain that we're studying. The red dots, San Mateo and Matucana are the places through which George Kiefer passed in raiding the first of the Wayos. The blue spots are the places that are most prominent in the Huarochirí manuscript, and they were the main sites of settlement of the people called Checa. So now we know for sure that this is an intercultural artifact. It's from the highlands, Serranos, probably speakers of an Aymara-like language, and Yuncas, coastal people, who it seems knew Quechua and probably another language. But we're at Supe, purple dot at the top of the coastal profile, 5 valleys away. An eminently Yunca site. And so it's time for us to start wondering whether it could not be that making Wayos, rather than being an endogenous highland tradition, was one of the many, many, many behaviors of the coastal or Yunca people, which the Highlanders, as they advanced, adopted. The greatest scholar of the Huarochirí manuscript, Gerald Taylor, speaks of their haste to assimilate, and it's very understandable. It's not such a different case from the case of the Central European militarized herders who worked their way into China and eventually became a dynasty. And as they did so, became Chinese in their ways of culture. Likewise, these llama and alpaca herding people who were known in the ancient world as heroically strong, but also rough, ignorant, coarse in their lifestyle. Quitayayo is the word that's used in this manual. Quitayayo means a wild animal that won't let you get near it. Those people, as they approached the splendid civilizing centers of the coast, hoped to become what they beheld. And maybe the story of Wayos is a part of that. This geography also tells us that it's a wider geography than Chris and I had guessed.
About 5 more minutes, 5 or 10 more minutes, 5 or 10 more minutes more.
5 minutes? Yeah, okay, I'm on it.
Awesome.
This is what San Mateo de Huancho looked like when Kiefer met with the tomb raiders to buy those skulls. And from that expedition, there appeared a report in the Hometown, California newspaper. It was also published in Spanish. And it says that scarcely half a league away in the canyon of the Cave of the Dead, there is a cave with mummies of ancient Indians. The Indians in all parts have thousands of concerns. One of these, which we need to take note of, is that they firmly believe that the rains will cease if anybody takes a mummy away, if anybody takes away those ancient Jews that they call by the name of grandparents. Vladimir Bravo is a young archaeologist who is now working in the Rimac Valley, looking for places that might be the 12,000-foot origin of the Washington Wayo. These are some of his preliminary photos, including a cave called Carcata, a very typical late pre-Columbian ancestor cave, very disturbed as they all are by various kinds of religious and commercial raiding from middle 17th century up to today, but viable as an archaeological site. How do the Peruvians feel about it? It is a superstition among the Cholos that anybody who touches an Inca's grave will dry up and die, and that the dead will suck his blood. On his visit to San Mateo to obtain specimens for the Smithsonian, the town turned out for Kifa to receive him with clubs and stones. Cultural disturbances. The conclusions which I'm summarizing here, I'm sure you have already registered in your own thinking. But the question remains, what to be done about it? Chris is a strong partisan of repatriation. And I must say that this is a stronger than usual case for repatriation. We're not talking about the kind of sloppy thinking which makes people say that just because an object was made in the ex-sovereign country of the globe, the object must be given to its government. It's a much stronger case. It means that here we have an object which was made by a more or less known population of people for a more or less known kind of reasons, and we know that they still have feelings about this object. And so, in the last few things that we've done include conferences with teachers and local government people in these villages. We're still many yards away from being able to do anything about it because of the problem of permissions that are involved, the problems of possible movement, not even to say export of these objects, who knows. But at least we've gotten started on the task of trying to restore a decent relation between ancient generations and our own. And I thank you very much.
We have about 10 minutes for questions, so I open the floor to you. For folks on the Zoom, feel free to type your questions and I will try to get to them there. Yeah, go ahead.
I've a wonderful, fascinating. I want to say it was a wonderful, fascinating talk. I have just a little question. One of those three masks has like a nose and this. Is that like something they put on afterwards to fill it out for the mask, or do they have these painted, or do you know anything about the covering?
Yes, now we know a lot about that. After the grizzly phase of corpse preparation had been done, when the bones were clean and dried and possibly already drilled, the prosthetic parts of the nose and eye sockets were repaired with a kind of gypsum plaster. And additional parts, not too visible in those photos, include the making of carved artificial eyebrows out of wood and remains of possible other parts that remain to be detected microscopically.
Other
I have a
questions?
question.
Gabriela?
So can we think of, for us working in performance and theater in Latin America, can we think this as maybe like the ancestors of the masks that are used today, particularly in the central Andes? I mean, we talked
Yes.
about this yesterday, but I wanna like share like with it, but.
Gabriela Yepes is alluding to a certain ritual complex which is famous in the central Peru,
called the Waconada de Mito. Mito is the town where it's done. And its central feature takes place with people wearing very large wooden masks, some of which show a kind of extreme rendering of the features of old age, and others of which seem to represent young and heroic people. It has been studied by at least one good Peruvian scientist. And of course, the issue here is one that I used to scuffle with my dear archaeological colleagues here, and that is the problem of ethnographic analogy. Can we use, or should we use, data of modernity to illuminate objects of antiquity? My answer is yes, comma. One can do that if there is a good degree of diachronic relationship, a documentation or other evidence connecting the old with the new. And in this particular case, the case is incomplete, but as a preliminary determination, it's pretty good. And I expect that when people become interested in the idea of masks, which are, of course, a very Peruvian theme as well as famously Mexican theme, when people become interested in this as not just as the creation of a show, but as the creation of a person, a custom-made hero, then people will start working harder to find, for example, historic masks, discarded ones, or unexplored dialogue with those who know how to make masks. In Pupicocha, the village where I recurringly did ethnography for some 12 years, there is a secret society called the Curcuches. Curcuches means the little old men, the little bent-backed, hunchbacked men who do a comic dance, which is interpreted as the announcement of the coming rain, the promise of rain. And there is some reason for thinking this might be the coming rain, of course, it means Omapacha. So there is some reason to think that this also might be a culturally linked tradition.
Frank, you have a question on Zoom, so I'll read it to you.
Please.
And yeah, we can talk. All right, so Felicia Torres asks, has there been any link between the keeping of trophy heads and the sightings of giants in certain regions of South America?
Giants in South America. I don't know what sighting Felicia Torres is referring to,
Okay.
but around 1600, and afterwards, particularly in the middle and late of the 17th century, there were assertions about giants, particularly in what is now the Ecuadorian coast and the Isle of Puna, which is the northernmost island off of Peru, about the existence of giants, probably based on the discovery of fossils and including some fairly colonial sounding mythology about how these were ancient people addicted to terrible sins, notably homosexuality, who had now to be destroyed in the light of Christian revelations. But I do not know, the Huarochirí manuscript doesn't particularly mention giants. All I can say about that genre of memories is that it tends to come to us through mid-colonial rather than early cultural contact.
More questions?
Yeah, Catherine Bowie.
Talk loud. I'm confused. So the skulls are from, in the beginning, you talked about warriors. But then there's thousands of skulls.
So were those ordinary people? What were normal funerary practices?
Excellent questions.
Let's say warriors because of these phrases. Al kapi nya aktitinsi. That means catching them, seizing them in a fight, in war, in a state of enmity. How many of the dead became Wayos? We really don't know. We only know that it was a widespread practice. But we can infer just from the existing numbers that a very small number of the treasured dead were saved in the form of Wayo. In fact, the overall profile of the Wadochiri manuscript, it's usually, if people understand it, they usually mistakenly think that it is an epic of war, something like the Iliad. It's really not. This Wanyuchi Wangi says this man about to die, you are going to kill me. That is the only time that the word kill is used in this entire 31 chapter book. The other places where Wanyuchi occurs, they were about killing a fire or killing a hunted animal. And so there's some room to doubt, and at least one good archaeologist has doubted whether this story is as warlike as we've made it out to be. We also know that the same manuscript contains a spellbinding chapter about the conservation of the dead. And in answer to Catherine's question, at this place and time, the normal treatment of the dead was mummification, including the maintenance of the mummy with full dress and a full social life. Okay, this is a key fact to know and a key fact to remember when we enter into foolish disputes about the evil qualities of studying the Native American dead. In the Andean analysis, or even philosophy, you could even dare to say, of life and death, of life and mortality, death is not conceived of as the going out of a light, the end of the person, and the necessity to remove and disappear his or her disgusting remains. No, on the contrary. The word Wanyui in Quechua is understood to be the name of a transition, a long gradual transition. Quechua-speaking places where I have lived, if people say about a person, Nyawanyumi, they say now he's dying. It doesn't mean he's a cadaver. It means he has an illness that he probably won't recover from. And after he has lost his life by our criteria, he's not considered to be an ex-person. He's said to be a wanyuch, a person who is in the transition process. Is wanyuch, is becoming another kind of person. And there then follows a very complex technical and ritual sequence for turning a wanyuch into an enshrined, dressed, socially honored ancestor. The highest degree of that transition, the perfection of it, is called the malki. This is a word that many Peruvians know. A malki is one word for a tree, but it also is the word for a finished, culturalized ancestor. Just as a tree is the immovable stem of movable and vital branches, so an ancestor is the immovable stem of the vitality that we share. And I guess I can just finish off the answer to Catherine's question by saying that transition, which I've just talked about, explains the immense majority
of preserved Peruvian bone remains.
Folks, we've reached the end of our time. Please join me in welcoming